Hey guys, this is Mike Mahaffey, the old bastard BJJ guy, here for BJJ Mental Models. Back in my day, we had to walk uphill in the snow both ways to get to the academy just to learn some crappy technique from a random purple belt. You kids have it so easy because now you can just subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium and get tons of great audio courses to learn new techniques, enhance your mindset, and entertain yourself. You can even get personalized rolling reviews from some of your favorite BJJ Mental Models coaches, including me. It's like having your own seminar, you spoiled little whippersnappers. So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium right now, get off my lawn, and go train.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 320. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. And today, I'm here with a first-timer on the podcast. I got Scott Fritzinger from Guerrilla Jiu-Jitsu Academy, Reno on the line. Scott, how is it going, sir?
Hey, it's going well. Thanks for having me on, Steve.
I am happy to have you, my friend. Now, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and your academy? We actually recently did a bit of a collab. Kelsey Carter, who's been on the podcast before, did a seminar at your school that we sponsored. But beyond that, go on and tell everyone about who you are and what your gym's all about.
My name is Scott Fritzinger. I'm the owner of Guerrilla Jiu-Jitsu Academy in Reno. I'm a black belt under Dave Camarillo, who is the head and original founder of Guerrilla Jiu-Jitsu. And I've been training for just over 20 years.
Nice. Well, I'm glad to have you here. Why don't you talk about a bit about the gym? Reno is an area that I actually don't really have a lot of roots in, but I'm also super curious about what the scene is like there, what your gym's like, what the culture is like. Tell us about what you've built.
So Reno, when we have people come in from other cities, they kind of remark about how unique Reno is. Most of the instructors in this area came up together from white belt. Starting back in the year 1999, 2000, there was a single school, and a lot of us started training back then. We've eventually gotten our black belts. We've eventually branched off, opened up our own schools. So the community is actually pretty tight knit. And so there is an immense amount of cross training that goes on between the schools. And so when people come in from other cities where cross training tends to be discouraged, or there are these immense rivalries between different schools, they just see people, at one school, they'll go train somewhere else the next day and they'll still see those same people training over there as well. And really when it comes to, citywide culture, it's amazing to be able to find a school, find a class to drop into when you have time and head over there, see friends you've known for years and just roll. A lot of those jiu-jitsu politics just don't pop up in Reno. And so that's really a function of a lot of the people here just knowing each other over decades, really, at this point.
Awesome. Well, you had an awesome topic in mind, Scott, that I thought was really interesting, probably pretty timely for a lot of people in our audience as well. I'll maybe turn it over to you to introduce it. Why don't you explain what we're going to be talking about here today?
Well, one of the things that has been instilled in me since I started training under Dave is the language that we use daily when we instruct, where we refine people's technique, when we talk to them post-training, when we talk to them and coach them through competitions as well. It's the language that we use is important. It's not just communicating with them ideas, but it's also communicating culture with them. And so because of my history and because of my early injuries, I've liked thinking about injury and the language around injury as well. Not just the role that language plays during recovery from injury, but the role that language plays in prevention of it from the get-go, and how it instills mindset and how it affects how techniques are performed and how it affects how drilling is performed and how it affects how people roll and the decisions they're making for rolling and how they prioritize those decisions away from injury, day to day.
This is a really exciting thing to discuss because I haven't heard anyone else talk about it in this way before. When we talk about injury prevention, so often we're talking about banned techniques in the gym or rolling intensity, and that's all well and good. But I think there is this higher level item to discuss, which is the culture around the gym and around how we train. I mean, you can tell people that you're banning dangerous techniques, but if you're still instilling this culture that you come here to fight, then I would assume that leads to a greater risk of injury. And I assume that's probably part of what you're talking about when you're saying that you use language to steer this direction and to make things safer. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. Overall injury risk, I believe, is highly tied to school culture. And school culture is defined from the top down. So if you show up and like everyone's got knee sleeves on and there are people with like, saying, don't touch my left arm, or my right arm is injured. And, the majority of the people on the mat are like that. I mean, that's a culture issue with the school and not necessarily an individual issue. And it's also about who a school attracts and who a school allows to continue training there. There are some people who are not quite ready for jiu-jitsu in their life because they come in and they are a danger, not just to others on the mat, but also a danger to themselves. And so the immediacy of injury risk that they present to the school, it just might not be the time for them to step on the mat. That's part of what feeds back into the school culture as well, is when you step on the mat any given night, what is your chance for injury based on how the school functions and who is there?
Yep. And I find this so interesting because as a more experienced practitioner, you get this kind of sixth sense when a new person comes into the gym, and you often can just tell right away if they're going to be one of those people.
Oh, yeah.
Often there's a white belt who came in and they're here to scrap and they are going at 200% trying to win. And the thing that I always find frustrating as a black belt is often when this happens, the head coach is going to grab you as one of the senior people and say, hey, you go roll with that crazy guy, right? And the idea is that you're supposed to help kind of calm them down. I mean, I got to say, as a black belt, I hate doing this because I get nothing out of it. All I get is to assume a bunch of risk because some lunatic wants to try to jump on my head or something. Right?
Oh, yeah.
And I think there's an argument to be made that that's a problem with culture as well. This idea that if someone is out of control, you solve that by beating them into submission and enforcing them. As you know, I am not a fan of that mindset, but I'll turn it over to you to maybe tell me how you guys deal with that situation when some wild person comes into the gym.
Oh, I absolutely hate enforcer culture. I think that it's a way of trying to do something in an incredibly inefficient way. If you go after someone and they're trying to come after you and you come out on top, well, they're just going to point to your belt and say, well, you beat me because of your belt. And they're going to go find someone with a lighter color belt. Instead of trying to actually communicate and use your words and say, hey, this created increased risk of injury, blah, 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 right? Or you speak with them afterwards. And this is how I approach it. If I get someone coming in for a trial and, they're on the mat and they're pushing hard and they're breathing heavy, and it looks like even during the drilling, they're on the edge of throwing up, I will jump in with them. And just like I said, I use my words to walk them and talk them through the drill rather than expecting them to do it harder or do it faster, or the technique's not working, so I have to go harder and faster. It's like, no, let's do this. And the tone in my voice is also what kind of settles them down. There's not an urgency in my voice. It is calm. It is straightforward. It's, hey, do this, and this is why we do it. Perform the technique. And so, yeah, enforcer culture is the antithesis of that. It's the antithesis of actually learning. So, and it really reinforces this concept of being put in your place, which is not why people sign up for jiu-jitsu. They sign up to jiu-jitsu to learn, not be put in their place day to day.
Yeah. The other thing too about enforcer culture, which is such a problem, is, look, yes, it is true that if you're a black belt and the other person is a white belt, that you can probably slow them down and, make them learn through practice. I suppose it's true, but it dramatically increases the risk of injury for both people, including the more senior person. Everyone assumes that if you're a black belt that you can just beat someone who's a white belt. And maybe that's true, but that doesn't come without its own risk of injury. If you are constantly having to play this enforcer role in the gym, after dozens and dozens of times of doing it, eventually, even if you're an amazing black belt, something's going to happen and that out of control person is going to injure either you or themselves, and it's going to be bad. So I am really not a fan of that culture that we teach people physically by putting them in their place. I think that is so toxic in jiu-jitsu. And something that you talked about, which I think is interesting there, is using your tone of voice, which is a new one for me. I would imagine people coming in and saying, well, we alter the vocabulary in our gym to avoid making it sound like things are more violent than maybe they're intended. But tone of voice is a powerful indicator and signal. And I'd love to know how that comes into play when you're talking about kind of speaking calmly. What does that sound like? And how can someone practice a skill like that?
So I tie a lot of this to urgency. When we create urgency on the mat, we create injury for risk generally increases. More urgency, people associate that with speed, people associate that with more power and pressure. And so even in the language that we use day to day, like right now, I'm kind of talking a little bit faster, but when I'm discussing techniques, I will slow my phrasing down. I'll not talk through a technique quickly. Okay, so we're here, we change our levels, we drop the knee down, we apply pressure with the hip, we clear the far arm, we bring our other foot in, and we step over. And then, repeat that 3 times. Because the pacing I want to establish is in the demonstration, and that's the pacing that I want them to do the technique as well. And so speaking slower, speaking more distinctly, it gives me more time to use 2 or 3 different terms for the same concept to possibly register with 2 or 3 different people the way that they think about the technique, right? Try to create some familiarity with technique with what they know. And then it's the pacing in the language and the instruction, which is going to help define the pacing with the drilling afterwards, which is going to help define the pacing with a flow rolling later, which is going to help define the pacing with the live rolling in class later as well. And so it may sound like kind of drawn out and it may get boring if I talk too much, which I tend to do. And that's something I need to work on. But it's really the pacing and the language and the vocabulary I'm using that I'm trying to instill this sense of take your time, work your way through the technique, but you don't have to do it quickly.
I love that. And it's interesting because as someone who's having to maybe speak for the first time in front of a class and they're not really comfortable doing that, when we get nervous, we tend to violate those guidelines. The more nervous we get, the faster we talk, the more we talk. And that's a natural habit that a public speaker needs to learn to overcome. How can I slow myself down to control the energy in the room? And how can I say less when it makes sense to say less? When you're doing something like a podcast like this, of course we're going to talk, but the thing people often neglect to understand is you get better at jiu-jitsu by doing the jiu-jitsu. And so for every minute that the instructor is talking, that's a minute that the people in the room don't get to train. And there's a balance, of course. I don't buy into the argument that talking has no value. I think there's tremendous value in establishing clear and aligned language. But also we have to bear in mind that we want to keep that to a minimum so the people in the room can get their reps in. This reminds me of many, many years ago when I got my driver's license. I remember the first driving instructor I had terrified me because she was just constantly like yelling and screaming. And as a new driver who wasn't used to driving, I was just like terrified having her in the car because she would just bark orders and scream, don't do that. Don't do that. No, go over there. Go right. And it was so frazzling. And I started thinking like, I'm just incompetent at this. I just can't actually drive. This is so hard. And then I switched and got a different instructor and he was so much more laid back and chill. And I was still kind of in that panicky mode. And I'd be like, what do I do? What do I do? And he'd be super calm. And he would say, you've got this. You know what to do. Just you do what you're doing. Be calm. Take your time. And that change in approach helped me so much. And I think sometimes we forget to take this into account when we're training people who are already scared because they're in a new environment. When you speak in a manner that is intense and you're fast and you're high energy, there is a time and a place for that, of course, but that can get people more anxious. Whereas kind of being a calming factor in the room, I think can help things so much, especially if the nerves are already higher because someone is inexperienced at this martial art.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's 100% true. I've been in rooms, I've been in seminars, I've been taking classes from tons of different instructors over the year. And by and far, the classes, the seminars, the material I take away from those times, it lands more solidly in my brain and then therefore in my game are the people who displayed it in a very clear and concise manner without this urgency of like, you have to do this and you have to do this and you have to do this, right? And like, I go back to Dave Camarillo again, the way that he coaches is that you won't hear him raise his voice. You won't hear him really kind of like, he doesn't yell. He doesn't create a sense of urgency when he is coaching. He is conveying information. And it is a very kind of like, it's a calming force. And it really speaks to me whenever I've had the fortune to take one of his classes or one of his seminars. And it's something I've tried to put into my instruction as well, is that I used to, like you were saying, I used to talk way too much, more than I talk now, which with my students, they'd probably think that's unheard of or impossible. So, but also too, is that it's helped me really see how powerful the way that we talk can have an influence on the way that we train.
Yeah. And it's interesting because some of this advice is the same that we give people when we tell them how to relax in jiu-jitsu. We talk about be relaxed, control your breathing, don't be too explosive. And as a coach, you can also bring this in as a factor when you're explaining things, right? Because if you are more relaxed in the way that you speak, that kind of sets a tone for the intensity of the room as well.
Oh, it does. I found it like if I go in there, I've had one too many coffees and I say, okay, we're going to warm up. We're going to do this. I'm speaking too quickly. And like 1 minute into that, it's like, well, we're no longer warming up. We're just rolling. So I'm like, whoa. I have to bring them all back and just go, let's slow it down a little bit. These are warm up rolls, right? And so it sets the tone. It sets the pacing. And so that is for me, that's a really important thing to define that. Another thing that I've actually kind of found important is I know it's generally discouraged, and I've seen people like writing online about how it kind of annoys them, but I encourage communication during drilling. I encourage communication during isolated rolling. I encourage communication during live rolling as well. I know there's some people who just want to say, shut up and roll. And for them, if that's what they need, awesome. I'm fully behind you on that. But when we take the time to actually talk our way through a drill, it slows us down. So we decide that we're going to start, I need to do this. Okay, now I need to do this. Now I need to do this. And that just inherently slows the process. It engages the brain. It starts creating this feedback loop within ourselves to be able to execute a technique from beginning to end at a pace where there is significantly less urgency because I've given you permission to talk. And being able to give permission to talk not only means that we can execute a new technique or an existing technique or just an entire, thread from beginning to end at our own pace. And when we're given permission to talk, it allows us to work through things at our own pace. And if it annoys our partners, that's okay as well. It's a learning environment. So we're going to be a little bit annoyed sometimes. Not everyone learns the same way. So I had a student years ago, he had moved away. And he used to joke about, oh man, I'm always asking questions. I'm always talking when I'm doing drilling. And I'm like, that's good. I think that's a good thing. And he was really self-conscious about it, like in a joking manner. But he would talk his way all the way through the drill. And I'm seeing him actually execute those techniques later during live rolling. And that's how he learns. But it slowed down how he was executing a technique, which gave him time to think, which gave him time to register what went right and what went wrong. And so pacing can be done just with communication between our partners.
Yeah. And that's always an interesting discussion to have because, like you brought up, some people hate when you talk during the roll. That's understandable because when you're speaking during the roll, you're taking away the time to do reps. And ultimately, you're going to get better by doing reps. But that said, I think there is a place for communication mid-roll. I mean, if you are legitimately stuck, and there's something that you just don't understand, then it makes sense to ask, I think. But then beyond that too, I think that often we care so much and we talk so much about like the motor acquisition in jiu-jitsu, how our body actually learns to move. We talk so much about that. And I think sometimes we don't talk enough about the more cognitive side of jiu-jitsu, which is thinking deliberately about what's happening. I think it is a good practice to try to conceptualize jiu-jitsu. I just did a newsletter on this a while back about how one of the things that I've observed with pretty much everyone who hangs around the sport and gets to brown and black belt is eventually they will try to come up with a way to conceptualize jiu-jitsu, right? They'll try to come up with governing concepts that explain this whole thing. And maybe they'll borrow those definitions from someone else. Maybe they'll come up with their own. Maybe they'll combine the new and the old. But that's a common practice, which is that as people get more experience, they try to build out a mental framework to make sense of what this thing really is that we're all training. And I don't think that you want to shut that process down. I think it's valuable. I think it makes it easier for you to communicate with other people about jiu-jitsu if you think in that way. And so I agree with a lot of people who say, you don't want to be talking too much during class, of course. You don't want to be asking so many questions that you're not even getting the reps in. But I also think that there is a lot of value in the verbal side of things and in idea exchange. And again, I think that's an area of the sport that is underappreciated. And I tend to agree with you. If people want to chatter or ask questions or troubleshoot while they're just practicing something, I think it's a good thing. It can get out of hand, but I think in most cases it's probably good. And if nothing else, it builds a stronger relationship between you and your team.
Oh, absolutely. And that is definitely it. I'll walk around, and if someone is, they're having a conference, I'd be like, oh, hey, let's get back into the drilling. Where are you at? And they'll ask a question. I'll give them some guidance from there and get them back on task. So, and there are definitely people who like to talk more than other people. And to a degree, that's okay. But like you said, it has to come back to mat time. You have to get your reps in as well. And so that communication should be in the moment. It can set up, discussion for like parking lot stuff afterwards, where it's like, you're standing out by your car and you can ask some questions on how they did something, right? But it goes back, I also talk about creating windows in our training where we're going at a pace where we can actually think, and those windows being larger or smaller, depending on where we are in our training and how fast we're going. And those windows provide us opportunity, is that we won't be able to remember items for later discussion if we're going too fast and too hard. There won't be those like parking lot discussions afterwards where people get an immense amount of value. And so it's a fine balance between talking too much and not talking at all.
Yeah, it's another thing too, where I think people don't understand the benefit that talking has with the other people in the room. I mean, if you are just focused on individual skill acquisition and getting countless reps and training time in the gym, that does have its value, but ultimately you're perhaps losing out on the opportunity to really do team building and to get to know the people around you. And on the topic of injury prevention, I would presume you're a lot less likely to be overly intense with someone if it's someone that you know and you trust and you're friends with them. If it's a stranger, it's a lot easier to just kind of use them like a training dummy. Whereas if it's someone that you actually know, you're going to be invested in their success as well. And something that we have talked many times on this podcast about is the importance of looking at learning jiu-jitsu as a collaborative thing rather than as a solo thing. And so again, I think that's where that communication comes into play. It may not technically help you get better at motor acquisition, but there's a lot of other benefits as well that I think at the end of the day, over the long term, could wind up being more important for many people, which is like, how do I integrate with this team? How do we all keep each other safe? What is the communal gel that holds us all together?
Oh, yeah. There is an immense amount of risk and an immense amount of associated trust in what we do day to day. We're trusting that when I tap, the other person is going to let go. We're trying to trust the other person, not intentionally injure me. Accidents happen, but intent to injure is a different thing altogether. And so that communication allows you to build that trust with the other person. The more you talk to someone, the more you become familiar with them, the more you become familiar with their intentions in class, their reason for training, the more comfortable you get with, putting your limbs and your consciousness on the line with them. But in even terms of like physical skill acquisition, that feedback, we help other people build better technique with that feedback and that communication. One of the big things that I am super like focused on and a stickler about are chokes and how chokes are applied, where chokes are applied, and finishing mechanics on chokes. And so when we're working chokes, let's just say like a rear naked choke, I'll have a person seated, person kneeling behind them, and I want them to be able to apply an isolated rear naked choke, quote unquote, perfectly against the carotid jugular and not catch any throat into finishing mechanics. But you can't figure that out unless the other person gives you feedback in the moment. So am I really applying pressure on either side of the throat? Am I really catching the majority of the carotid jugulars rather than catching windpipe, air pipe in the process? And so when we isolate chokes like that, regardless of the choke, we'll do isolated chokes and say, am I applying pressure in the correct place? And the person in front will provide feedback and say, hey, yeah, oh no, man, that was just a lot of, and they'll start coughing. That was a lot of throat. And so they can steer the other person physically, placing their bicep, placing the forearm, aligning the elbow. Now we got walking them through it. And so that kind of feedback feeds directly back into physical skill acquisition as well, because now it's like, okay, we've done isolated reps. Now let's grab it in the moment and do increasing progressive resistance over time and see if we can still nail it in quote unquote optimal condition or non-suboptimal conditions. Yeah, so that communication, I feel like early in my training, it wasn't quite there, but the more that I've allowed my students to communicate back and forth, it's exactly what you said, to create a tighter knit community where people build trust with each other. They're going to trust the other person to apply technique without, bad intent. And it's also going to feed back into the overall skill of the school, because now it's like, oh, that arm bar, wasn't quite aligned. It was off to the side. If you do this instead, oh, yep, that's definitely it. So it's just a technique multiplier allowing people to create that kind of feedback and close the feedback loop altogether.
Something I've been thinking about a lot recently is how if you're out in a competitive environment or doing a high intensity round, if you get injured in that situation, I mean, it sucks, right? But you also knew what you were signing up for, and it's not a surprise because you were in an environment where both people were trying to win, even if it means injuring the other person. That was the agreement. Whereas if you get injured in training, to me, it feels like that's probably going to feel a lot more tragic and upsetting because that's where it feels like a betrayal of trust. If I'm trying to roll gently with someone and they just rip a submission and I get injured, then not only am I injured, right? Not only does that take away from my training time and possibly cost me money, but I also feel to some extent like my trust has been betrayed. I'm separating this from total freak injuries where no one could have anticipated things were happening. But when you're training with someone and you are trying to go gentle and then they violate that agreement by trying to inflict damage, that's where I think we get into problems, right? And again, I think that's where language comes into play as well. Rather than letting those people discover on their own that hurting your training partners is bad, I think it's best to cut that off at the gate. I think language is a powerful way to do that. And we've talked about tone of voice. I would also like to know about selection of words. When you're explaining things to students, do you curate your language to make sure that you're not using aggressive language? And what would that look like?
Oh, yeah. I am an overthinker day in, day out. And so I use my words, I choose my words very carefully, right? A lot of the language I use is focused on process and not outcome, meaning that, for example, in jiu-jitsu, the concept of control, there's no such thing really as control, but I talk about pinning and I talk about being dominant. And the outcomes are that I spent more time in a dominant position rather than I spent more time finishing the other person repeatedly. And so I tend to redefine success of a role in terms of not number of submissions gained, but in the amount of time I was able to stay out of a bad or poor position, or the number of times I was able to gain advantage through a transition. And so like another example would be if I spent like 2 minutes, I'm just stuck in someone's guard, but they've also not swept me. That is progress. I'm in someone else's guard. They have the advantage. Their feet are all over me, right? But I'm able to maintain my base posture and top position. It's like we redefine success in not only being dominant constantly, but also not allowing the other person to succeed in what they're trying to do.
Yeah. Something that I've been talking about a lot recently is how as I get more experienced in jiu-jitsu, I actually find I'm getting less submissions in the gym, which is kind of a bit of a paradox because I always would have assumed that as I get better at the sport, I would be submitting people more. But what I found is that in training, not a competition strategy, but in training, my goal is to kind of do what you've talked about, which is to maximize the amount of time that I spend in a good position, because that's a lot more predictable. If I jump on someone and I pass their guard and armbar them in 10 seconds, that doesn't really speak to my ability to make a fight predictable. That just means I'm good at blitzing sometimes, but who knows if that's going to work all the time. Whereas if I can slowly and gently maintain control, advance position, and then just stay in a dominant position for the whole match, that to me tells me a lot more about my jiu-jitsu, because that's ultimately what I want to be doing. I want to make the fight predictable. And this is kind of a change in my thinking over the years. When I was younger and more junior in the sport, I was very focused on getting submissions because we see that as the end result. And submissions are sexy and we want to get them. But as you train more and more, you realize that getting a lot of submissions really quickly against a lot of junior grapplers is not that impressive, right? That isn't really not only is it not going to make you better, but it doesn't really say anything about your jiu-jitsu either. Because if you play that kind of game, high risk, high reward, where you're going for submissions all the time, but you're not thinking about holding position, you run the risk of turning every match into a dice roll where maybe it'll go your way, maybe it won't, depending on whether you get the sub. I would much rather build a game plan around having a highly controlled fight situation where I'm always in good position and they're never in good position, even if that means that I never go for a submission, right? I think that is a change in how my training has evolved over the years. And I think that through clever use of language, we can also encourage people in the gym to really emphasize that as well.
Absolutely. And I've found that has been my path as well. Before I became part of Guerrilla, I had never heard of the concept of like pinning. We had our traditional dominant positions, right? But Dave really introduced the concept of pinning to me and did a little seminar on it back in 2014. And my game changed. It changed overnight. My focus changed overnight because before that, it was like, okay, well, it's about an end game. It's about the submissions. And then once I started focusing on pinning and control and understanding how to deny them the ability to move on their own and how to control as a concept is impossible in jiu-jitsu, but to how to actually limit movement is so much more interesting to me. Like I can do an armbar. I mean, I train under Dave, I train at Guerrilla, I can do an armbar. And so, but being able to get an armbar is one thing, but being able to maintain a position where I can see armbar options all over the place and still have that option, but maintain that position of control and transition to another position of control where there are different armbar options that I could take or could not take. I don't know. I find that part of the game so much more interesting to me. And because we're not bordering up against the end game, and the end game in jiu-jitsu with submissions, really that is the closest that we get to high risk overall in terms of injury. It's late taps, it's moving into a submission too quickly. They move the quote unquote wrong way when there's a submission in place where we are demonstrating really good pinning control and applying the submission in a really controlling manner. I mean, when we talk about injuries overall, that's where the majority of injuries, in my opinion, from my experience, occur. And so why really focus on the end game if the end game is, and it's like you said earlier, submissions are the fun part. And it doesn't mean don't go for them. It's just with the recognition that moving towards them and trying to get that tap just increases the risk of injury overall. So day to day when we're in training, which is actually just practice, anytime we step on the mat, it is practice. And one of the things I really like to say every single day is you don't try to win at practice. Nobody actually gets to win at practice. It is really focused on the controlling aspect, the pinning aspect, and we do submissions, don't get me wrong, but the submission isn't the ultimate victory at practice. The ultimate victory is that I was able to maintain a position of control that allowed me to move to a submission, which is actually just an increased level of control with a slightly different position, right? Submissions are the culmination of increasing levels of control until the other person has no choice but to tap and acknowledge that they're done. They're done. There's nothing they can do because you have isolated and full control over a limb or over their neck.
I think that is such a key realization that a submission is just a position. It just happens to be a position where the control is so great and the other person is so immobile that it would be easy for you as the person holding that position to inflict injury. We did a whole series of episodes on our premium service with Rob Bernacki about this, where he broke down the idea of submission as position from so many of these major submissions and realizing that when you're holding someone in a submission, it doesn't always have to be with the intent of finishing immediately. And in fact, the desire to try to finish it too quickly can often result in you losing the position that you've got. So I think that focus on emphasizing control is so much better for skill development.
Yeah. And that was something else that, Dave had pointed out to me years ago as well, is that in Guerrilla, we have what we call SAP, seated or standard armbar position. And Dave has shown this on his videos, is a video up on YouTube on this as well, where we're seated cross-body to them with our feet crossed behind the forearm. And this position, it's a pinning position. The person on the bottom has no ability to turn left or right on their own. They can't sit up because there's pressure down across their chest. And all we're looking to do is just basically bring that arm away from their body. And so that very finishing position itself, it's a demonstration of incredible pinning control. And the finish there is a formality. And that's where that's the kind of like language I like to use, is that you get into a position where the finish is a formality, where you have taken away so many unknowns that the only outcome at that point, unless they really work their way out and really fight to get out of that position, is a submission. And so, but those are the kinds of positions that I like to hang out in. Those are the positions that are interesting to me. And it's that curiosity that I also try to instill in all of my students as well, is like, okay, the finish could be just right there, but what if you don't finish, right? It's what I tell them is that the submission is an increase in ultimate form of control and isolation, but what if we don't finish? What if we don't, extend that arm all the way out? What if we just hug onto the arm? What can they do? How can we maintain this position? And so that focus on pinning, that focus on control is part of an overall injury mitigation strategy, where when you have control, there is less overall urgency. And with less overall urgency, you are lowering the risk of injury.
Yep, great insight. As a guy who's always been interested in self-defense, I also think there's an argument to be made that positional control is way more valuable from a self-defense perspective. We often think that the submission is the end of the fight. And look, under a competitive rule set, yes, it is. But look, meth is a hell of a drug, right? You get someone in an arm bar and you break their arm. There's no guarantee that's the end of the fight. You put someone in a chokehold and you choke them out. There's no guarantee that the fight's still over when they wake up. Whereas if you can just sit on someone until the cops get there, that will end the fight, right? So to me, I think positional control, even from a self-defense standpoint, is underrated in its value.
Oh, absolutely is. I have a lot of friends who are police officers who also train, which, I feel like every police officer should be training regularly, just for various reasons, obviously. But it is the ability to, maintain dominance, to assert control on another person, possibly to settle them down. But like you said, meth, you're not going to settle down someone up on meth. But it also gives you options. And that's a huge thing, is I have the option to sit there and try to hold down the other person and try to control the other person, maybe get them to settle down. But I also have the option to book it out of there if it's clear to do so. It also gives me time to assess my surroundings. That is a huge thing, a situational awareness of what's going on around me. Has anyone actually called the cops yet? So the self-defense aspect is something I'm constantly thinking about. It's something I bring up in class as well. It's something that we will train on occasion. But that feeds back into this idea that, control and dominance are the definitions of success in day-to-day training, and not necessarily, like I said, how many submissions you get, how many arm bars you get.
Yeah. Let's get tactical here for a second. So you're the coach in the gym. You want to exploit the power of language to alter the culture in your gym and to cool things down so that people focus on getting better and not focusing on fighting. What are some of the words that you would choose to use to get that point across? And what are some of the words that you would just never use? As an example, common mistake, people refer to the rounds in the gym as fights. I think that using that language specifically encourages people to be more intense than is actually going to help anyone. But I would want to hear from you in terms of how you curate the language in your gym. Any specific do's or don'ts for words that you either like to use or that you like to avoid?
I'll tell people when we are doing drilling rounds, that these are not live rounds. I say you want to roll to learn, you don't want to roll to win. And that helps kind of create a mindset going in. It's not about necessarily end game, but we're trying to roll and we're putting the emphasis on trying to apply what we learned that day, or really what the current module is. I run modules anywhere between 4 to 6 weeks, and try to apply those within the role. I constantly like using the word practice, even over the word drilling, because practice implies that it's okay to make mistakes and it's okay to make decisions that lead us down the wrong path. Practice also implies that the outcome is going to be improvement and learning. And even just using that word in place of several other words, I don't use the word fight. I don't use the word even spar, because spar has its own implications of more like a live situation. Right. I like using phrases such as, if you can't think, you're going too fast. It's something I mentioned earlier about creating windows for thought. And the larger those windows are, the more you can think about what's going on, where you want to go, or what you don't want them to do. And so if you can't think during your rounds, you're going too fast, or your partner is. And so then we call back to the communication that I talked about, saying, hey, can we slow down just a little bit? I'm getting stuck here. And I say, okay. And then after a round, if you can't remember what you did, you went too fast or you went too hard. I think that a lot of our ability to learn and grow comes from after our exposure and not as we're being exposed to something. It's in the postmortems that we do after a round. It's in the postmortems that we do on the car ride home. And if it wasn't a good day, then that's the quiet car ride home with no music going on. And I'm sure we've all had those.
And this is maybe a great thing to talk about here when we talk about postmortems. The example you've brought up where, man, I got my ass kicked today, quiet car ride home, I'm depressed, I'm disappointed, I'm mad at myself because I lost in the gym. That's not a good mindset for skill development, right? But yet we've all been there. When you feel that way, it's because you went into class with the goal of winning, not with the goal of learning. Your goal in every class should be to get reps in, to get practice, because that's how your skill grows over time. If you're going to class and you're evaluating the quality of the class based on the number of wins and losses you got, right, in this imaginary scoring environment where no one's even counting wins and losses, then you're projecting onto yourself this failure that isn't really there. And similarly, if you feel like you should be getting better, but you're not, that's also not always a problem either, because you can't control the days that you get better, right? It's not a linear growth path. Your goal as an athlete is to just get as many reps in, get quality reps in, and then over time, if you're training intelligently, your skill will get better. So I think that your example there of doing a postmortem is a really interesting one, because that makes practice less of a fight and it makes it more of a lab experiment. Just like if you're doing an experiment, you try something and then whether it works or doesn't work as you expect, you reflect and you try again differently the next time. So when you talk about postmortems, discussing what happened after a roll, I think that is a super powerful way to add a reflection practice, which won't just make you better because you're thinking about it more, but I think it also changes the tone so that it's less of a match and it's more of a practice, which, as you mentioned earlier, I think is ultimately the goal.
It is. And it also means that, like you said, how do we define a win in a class? If they're actually trying to define what winning is or losing is within a class, I think that it needs to be reframed. Their mindset needs to be reframed overall. Because like you said, it's about trends. It's about getting better, improving over time. And so if someone goes in trying to win, or maybe their win is finally tapping their nemesis, which, if it's a motivator for someone, that can be a powerful motivator. And I'm not going to say, don't try to tap that other person. But in the end of the day, did you get tapped by them less? Did you spend more time on top? Were you more time dominant over the course of your practice sessions with them? That's more of a win than whether or not you were able to submit the other person in my eye. That's hard to take for some people because they want those very, distinct, this is a win and this is a loss. This is a win, this is a loss. And it's hard to step back from those individual moments and look how things are trending over time. And so if I see someone that's had like a hard roll and they kind of step off the mat and go sit on the bench and obviously they're disappointed in it, I will go over to them and I will sit down and say, hey, halfway through that match, right, as he was passing, you were able to feed that underhook that we've been working for the past 2 weeks. That was really good. Before those past 2 weeks, I had never seen you try to shoot that underhook, but you did there. And I thought that was huge, man. I mean, that means that like you're thinking during the roll and you're applying what you're learning in class. I mean, nice job. Congrats on that. Sometimes you need an outside nudge and you need recognition from another person to reframe your mindset about what winning and losing is.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And it's better to put more emphasis on your daily practice than it is to chase specific results. Because like you said, you don't always win in the gym if that's what you're trying to chase, right? Submissions or whatever in the gym. And again, like I said, that's not even really a win if you tap someone in the gym. And similarly, you don't necessarily get measurably better every single day. The win should be, I showed up and I put in a good effort and I did things the right way. And if you do that enough, then the results will emerge over time. And I think, again, that's another example of where language can be very powerful. And something that I've started to think, the longer I train, the more I feel that really the most important thing in the training room is that people are having fun. We can talk about jiu-jitsu as a serious self-defense art or as a combat sport. But at the end of the day, skill development and getting better, all of that only matters if you stay around. And you're only going to stay around if you're enjoying what you're doing. So when people are so laser focused on skill acquisition that they forget to bring the joy into jiu-jitsu, I think they make a mistake of putting themselves into a position where they might have higher attrition in the future than they expected. And as a coach, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. I mean, my understanding is that you guys are a big believer in having a fun culture as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts on where fun and joy fit into the training practice, and if that's something that you can use language to help direct.
Ever since I can remember, every single time that I roll, every round that I've had, even in competition, I have had a big, stupid smile on my face throughout the entire course of the round, because training brings me joy, and getting rolls in with people I trust brings me joy. It is, for people who don't know me, they look at that and they might think it could even be considered insulting. It's like, this guy has a stupid smile on his face. I'm like, I'm sorry, man. I'm actually just having a really, really fun time right now. And so I think that, like everything about culture, it kind of starts at the top in the environment that you create. I think that when there is drilling happening, there should be laughing. I think when rounds are happening, there should be laughter as well. And you're not going to continue doing something unless you find joy in it. And that means different things to different people. Some people come in and are really serious, but they wouldn't keep coming back unless it was fun and they spoke to them in some way. But on a higher level, when we talk about having fun in training, it means that we reduce the urgency to try to finish. Here's calling back to that again, try to finish and, end that joy, end that fun, putting on submissions, slamming on submissions. It's not about the end game, it's about the process, and the fun is in the process. So creating a culture of having fun really is making sure that people understand that, one, it is okay to laugh, and two, it is okay to occasionally face plant, and that's fine, and it'll be funny if you do something completely wrong. It means that you create an opening for people to make mistakes, and the repercussions are not social within the structure of the school. No one looks at you and goes like, oh God, you screwed that up. It's like people will be like, oh man, they'll laugh along with it, and then you're just right back up on it. And so keeping things light is incredibly important. And I think that feeds into the culture of fun.
Yeah, I agree. I'm always surprised at how serious people take jiu-jitsu sometimes. I think that at the end of the day, jiu-jitsu is best when it's a playful game, and you can feel that culture in the gym. And a lot of the best gyms that I know, even if their focus is on competition and high performance, the best gyms that I know still have that playful energy in the room. And I think that's something that you as an instructor can always help cultivate. And maybe that's a good time to talk about your gym a bit more, Scott. But before we do that, any closing thoughts on the language of injury here that you want to discuss, things that we didn't talk about, which you wanted to fit in this conversation?
A lot of the hesitation I see in people wanting to try jiu-jitsu and start out in jiu-jitsu is centered around injury and potential injury. These are people who are working professionals. They go into an office day to day. They don't want to go in there with mangled fingers or black eyes or with a limp. They have to be professional. They have to have meetings with customers and clients, and especially if they're in sales or customer facing, that has large professional repercussions too. And so making sure that people like that feel comfortable training, that's kind of where my big focus becomes, is how do I create an environment where people can come in and not be afraid of having not only physical repercussions, but professional repercussions for risk of injury. And so one of the things years ago that John Frankel said, took a seminar, he was in town. He said, I make decisions today so that I can train tomorrow. And that really resonated with me. And I repeat that phrase constantly, because in the moment, if my brain goes, oh man, I really want to put on this arm bar and just, see it through and not let them move at all. It's like, okay, well, if I injure that person, I don't get to train with that person tomorrow. Or if I'm in a bad position, I want to blast my way out of there. I'm thinking like, man, in the process of this, I'm going to be exposing my arm. And if they jump to that arm bar, gravity is not going to save me. It's going to make it worse. Nope, it's just not worth it. I want to be able to train tomorrow. I want to be able to have fun with these people on the mat. I want to be able to make my stupid jokes when I'm displaying or when I'm demonstrating a technique. And I want to be able to participate in this culture of fun and learning regularly. And so injury and growth are inextricably interlinked. Injury can create growth opportunities, but also injury can prevent growth if those injuries are large enough and keep you from the mats. So make decisions today so that you can train tomorrow.
Awesome. Well, amazing advice, Scott. If people are listening to this and they think, man, I want to train at this guy's gym, tell us a bit about your gym and how people can find you and what the culture is like in the room.
So we are on the west side of Reno, which if you don't know Reno doesn't mean anything. But no, we are in West Reno. We have 5,400 square foot space with 2 large mat areas, one really large one for seminars, a smaller one for day-to-day classes. The atmosphere in the gym is we are open to everyone. And it says right on our uniforms, it is a Guerrilla motto, which is train with everyone. Anyone can come in and train. If you're coming in from out of town, we're probably not going to charge you a drop-in fee. I mean, just one-offs. We have people who come in like for once every couple months just to drop in and train at open mat or take a class, and it's nothing. We appreciate people coming in because it creates variety in the training and it brings another element into the school. But people, when they come in, people should expect to, well, 1, laugh, hopefully, at my stupid jokes, and 2, be ready to focus on the process and not necessarily the outcome.
Nice. Well, amazing, Scott. If people want to find your gym, I will put links in the show notes so that people can look you guys up. I'll also put a link to all of our stuff. Everything we make lives at bjjmentalmodels.com for absolutely free. You can get every episode we've ever done of the main feed podcasts like this one. We've also got mini episodes that just quickly introduce you to some of the main concepts we talk about on the show. Those are all in the main podcast feed. You can also join our awesome newsletter and see our online database of mental models for jiu-jitsu, all completely free at the same place. And of course, if you want to kick it up to the next level with us, BJJ Mental Models Premium is how you do that. Almost 600 subscribers strong at this point. It is, to the best of my knowledge, the largest content library of its kind on the internet, or in the world for that matter. If you're interested in conversations like this and you want a more course-like structure where we focus on the mental models, strategy, tactics, philosophy, and mindset of jiu-jitsu and less on the technical side, then this is where you go to get that. You can also get access to our amazing family of premium podcasts that are only available there. So if you're interested in, say, for example, Emily Kwok or Andrea Tang or Drew Foster, their podcasts are exclusive to BJJ Mental Models Premium. And you get access to our community, which many people subscribe just for alone by itself. So definitely recommend checking that out if you do become a member. You can also go up to our coaching tier. And if you do that, then you will get direct black belt coaching from some of the best in the world. Brianna St. Marie just recently won the IBJJF crown. She is one of our coaches. So if you want feedback from that caliber of athlete, you can join our coaching tier. And we're also starting to roll out more pro services. So if you are a jiu-jitsu gym owner or other business owner, let me know, shoot me a message, because we've got some kind of loose structured ideas about how I think we can leverage what we do here to help grow your business as well. So anyway, all of that lives at bjjmentalmodels.com. I will put a link to that and to, Scott, to your gym in the show notes. But Scott, man, thanks so much for coming by. I'm really glad we were able to have this chat.
Hey, Steve, thank you for having me on, and thank you for everything that you do for the jiu-jitsu community.
You're most welcome, sir. Thank you to the listeners too, and we'll talk to you next time. See you then.